Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists. This is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Well, the peak of hurricane season almost upon us. The tropics still going strong. Of course, last week it was all about Idalia. We had a long week tracking that storm. But in the meantime, if you missed it, we also had Gert, Harold, Jose, and Katia. Those storms did not impact us, but now we are tracking Tropical Storm Lee on today's episode of Tracking the Tropics. Of course, I'm your host, meteorologist Amanda Hawley here at the WFLA studios, and joined by my co-host Rebecca Berry as well. Today's featured meteorologist, a familiar face of the program, WKRG's chief meteorologist, Ed Bloodsworth. Thank you for joining us today, Ed.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so, talk of the town, right? Last week was Idalia. This week is going to be by far Lee, and that is because it is expected to become a major hurricane, possibly before the week's end. National Hurricane Center explicitly calling for that rapid intensification. Right now, we are seeing that storm in the central Atlantic, Rebecca, but over the next couple of days into the weekend, we're going to continue to see this storm strengthen. I'll send it to you at the wall so you can give us the very latest on the track and to look at some of those steering currents.
Yes, very important, those steering currents, and they're going to be ever evolving, even more important over the next couple of days.
Absolutely. So we will get you to the wall here, and you can. We also have that Invest 96L, the tropical wave that came off the coast of Africa. I'll send it to you to break it down.
Thank you so much. Yes, and so what we're seeing, we've been talking about what is now Tropical Storm Lee for a couple of days now, and that's because when it did pop up, it was in that zone that it's a sweet spot. The area that it formed in has the warmest sea surface temperatures basically in the Atlantic right now, as well as the trajectory does lend itself to where it could end up impacting the U.S. Unlike what we're seeing with 96L, where it's a little bit further north, the trajectory lends itself to be a fish storm. And so that's why we're watching Lee so carefully and so closely, because it could end up impacting the eastern coast of the U.S. If it were a weaker storm, we talked about the possibility of it potentially impacting some of our more southern areas, but it's not going to be a weaker storm. As you just heard Amanda say, it's expected to become a major hurricane within the next 48 hours. When you're looking at the satellite imagery, the eye is looking really healthy, and we're continuing to see the more evenly distributed bands of rain around the center of rotation, and so that's another sign that it's continuing to intensify. That minimum central pressure, 994 millibars, if it does start to rapidly intensify, we're going to see that pressure drop first. The maximum winds are just below hurricanes. We're sitting at 70 mile per hour winds right now. It will most likely be a hurricane at some point later on today, and expected to reach above that Category 3 status within the next day or so. It's moving to the west-northwest at 14 miles per hour, so it's sped up just a little bit. It was moving at 12 miles per hour earlier. Now it's at 14. And so here's that expected track showing it becoming a Category 2, then a 3, then a Category 4 over the weekend. And so we'll start to get some high surf impacts near the Lesser Antilles and near the Leeward Islands. As far as the surf goes, it's going to be pretty rough. Life-threatening storm surge, not storm surge, rip currents, I'm sorry. Life-threatening rip currents will be possible, especially on the northern portions of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. It's just going to be one of those situations where they get those huge waves, even though it's moving pretty far away from them at this point in a relative sense. And so if you watch the guidance, remember the cone is for the eye. It could be on either end of the eye. And so the impacts would be vastly different if it were to take the more southern part of this path or a more northern part of this path as far as what you could expect for Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. Now, the important part is it's making that turn to the north. We know stronger storms tend to make that turn earlier, and we've also got some steering currents out there that are helping guide the system to the north. And so we've got waves of high pressures. They're expansive high pressures really north of this system, and so air goes clockwise around a high pressure system, and so it's going to be pretty dependent on the position of this high right here and the air that's moving around it to help steer this system and help it make that turn to the north. We've also got the jet stream coming off of the southeast of the U.S., and that's also going to make it basically a pathway for this system to go. But that's a lot of things to come together, and so we will see some potential wobbles based on on if this high pressure system doesn't make it this far east, if the jet stream doesn't make it this far south. And so those are the big components and factors that could change when we're making our way through the next couple of days that will help steer this system and help guide it around this high pressure and then up through the jet stream. Now, the big question mark is, when you take a look at the long-term forecast models, is if it does make the turn, does it end up impacting the northern coast of the east coast of the United States, closer to anywhere north of the Carolinas, and become a superstorm up there? And that's a possibility. It's not out of the question, but hopefully the jet stream is able to turn it even further, pushing it out to sea and possibly making it a really, really powerful fish storm. And that would be ideal, but we know that these things change. And so the weakness in the ridge right here is where that system is going to make its break, basically, and make that turn through to the north. And so when you take a look at all of the spaghetti models, you can see that all of them are in pretty good agreement that that turn is going to happen, and all of them are in pretty good agreement that that turn is going to make it avoid the southeast U.S. And so that's good news for us, but it does depend heavily on the jet stream and the position of that high pressure, which can be mercurial this far out as far as forecasting that. Now, as far as dry air goes, it is surrounded by a lot of dry air, and sometimes some of that dry air can sneak in and weaken the system, but it's moving over such warm water, that's probably not going to happen. And you can see how healthy the system's looking, how it's continuing to grow in intensity as well as strength. As when we're taking a look at what factors are working against it, it is being impacted by shear today, but that shear is expected to relax a bit within the next 24 hours, and that will allow the system to rapidly intensify, especially as we head into the weekend. That weekend shear looks pretty low. That's when it reaches that Category 4 status, but it will move into some moderate shear after that, and so we'll have to keep an eye on it to see if that starts to compromise the integrity of the system and starts to maybe potentially weaken it, especially once it starts to make that turn. That's when it's going to move into the strongest shear. Once it does get to the north of Hispaniola and make its way up the coast, it will be entering a heavily sheared environment. And so sea surface temperatures, toasty warm, some of the warmest that we've seen in the Atlantic. And so it's in the warmest waters right now, and it's going to be in the warmest waters through about Thursday into Friday. But as we move into the weekend, it's moving into more normal waters, not as warm. Still warm enough to support a system, but it's just not that same fuel that it's over right now. Now, the only good news about this is I wish it would slow down just a little bit, because when tropical systems do move over warm waters, they take the energy from the water, and so it does cool the water down just a little bit. So it would be nice to have cooler waters out there. When we're taking a look at the difference between the Euro and the GFS, you can see they're in pretty close agreement. A wobble here, wobble there, but no big changes or no big diversions with the GFS and the Euro, and that gives us a higher confidence in the forecast, even though it is this far out and it's probably a little too soon to tell exactly where the system's going to end up or some of the impacts we'll see on the outer islands. The good news is the GFS and the Euro both agreeing on that turn, which would help it avoid much of the U.S. And so this is the next system to watch. It's Invest 96L. It has a 60% chance to develop over the next 7 days and a 30% chance over the next 2 days. It's most likely going to be a fish storm, just the way that it's moving and the direction that it's moving and its trajectory. Not really looking for much out of 96L, which is good. When, you know, we talked a lot about this on this season of tracking the tropics. With the wind shear like it is and the sea surface temperatures like they are, we did expect a high number of storms, but potentially more fish storms than anything else, and that's certainly been the case.
Absolutely, but of course we were impacted by Idalia last week. A lot of those storms, though, that I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, we had Gert, Harold, Jose, and Katia. Those kind of went by the wayside because, well, we weren't impacted by those. We were distracted, and rightfully so, by Idalia. There's a look at those forecast models from Invest 96L. So bottom line, your questions are already coming in. We love to see it. Of course, Tracking the Tropics is interactive, and we are going to be here answering your questions. You can use the hashtag #HeyAmanda, hashtag #HeyRebecca, and hashtag #HeyEd for our featured meteorologist today. Now, a lot of questions coming in because, of course, we are on high alert behind Idalia. Now, is this going to impact the United States? Is this going to impact Florida? I'll just get right to our first question here from Jesse on the WFLA Facebook page. Hashtag Tracking the Tropics. That will work as well. Will it hit Florida? And you know, Rebecca, you just went through all of those graphics talking about the steering currents. Now, right now, the chances for it to actually hit Florida are very low because of those steering currents. Our forecast models are in really good agreement that this is going to hook off to the north, but we are a week out, right? So we have some time for those forecast models to digest really those variables, where that high pressure is, where that weakness in the ridge is, and how strong that dip in the jet stream is going to be. And that's really going to answer all of those questions. But at the moment, the chance for it to hit Florida are very, very low. I do think that the eastern portion of the United States should be a little bit more on alert for this. And the bottom line, Ed, I think that we are going to see some really strong rip currents up and down the East Coast, because this is going to be a very powerful storm. It is going to have that classic hurricane look. It's going to send out those swells from the center of the storm, and they will reach the East Coast of the United States.
Yeah, you don't ever want to discount those. I know last week, of course, we were talking about a Category 4 Hurricane Franklin doing the exact same thing on the East Coast, kicking up the surf and the rip currents. And at least here on the Alabama Gulf Coast, one of the things I always preach every year, the number one weather-related killer on the Gulf Coast is rip currents. It's not tornadoes. It's not tropical weather. It is rip currents. And again, and then the wave activity. I know we're probably going to see a lot of surfers wanting to go out there on the East Coast, but this will kick up the surf from the Bahamas, as Rebecca mentioned, the north-facing beaches of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, all the way up to New England. And I think I would venture to say once we start getting some Hurricane Hunter flights out from NOAA and the Air Force Recon, I think we'll get a much better idea in terms of when this turn is going to happen. I know we got their good friends, the NOAA Hurricane Hunters down there in Lakeland. If they send that big G4 plane up and sample the upper level environment, which I venture to say they probably will with this over the Atlantic waters, I think we'll have a much better idea in terms of when that turn exactly takes place.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more balloon soundings go up from the National Weather Service office across the country to sample that trough and the dip in the jet stream. We're going to see those Hurricane Hunter flights begin as well to kind of get an idea of this atmosphere as it starts to get closer to land. Again, we are several days out here before this would possibly impact land, if it impacts land at all. Of course, that official forecast track there does bring it north of the Leeward Islands, keeps it north of Puerto Rico. So the strongest winds would stay offshore, but they would be impacted on the edge of it, right, with the surf and possibly some of those outer rain bands as well. We have another question coming in here. Hashtag, hey, Amanda from Katie on WFLA. Will we have any store to come to the coast the rest of the season here?
I believe that's storm.
What's that?
I'm pretty sure that's storm.
Storm. Yeah, will we have any storm to come to the coast the rest of the season? We have a long ways to go, Katie, with hurricane season. We're just now approaching the peak of hurricane season. We're not even there yet. Next week will be the peak of hurricane season. And then we have the rest of September and all of October to get through before we really see that decrease in the tropical activity. And if you're here in Florida, you are on the WFLA Facebook page there. So, if you're here in Florida, October, typically a little bit more vulnerable time for us here with tropical systems. So we got a long ways to go. Certainly not out of the woods yet in terms of the rest of the season. Nothing looming on the horizon within the next 5 or so days, though, for us here. So Rebecca, you have that the season averages up there. We've been looking at this, right? It was kind of early on for us to get Idalia last week in the Gulf and kind of where it came from. But certainly not out of the question to see another storm. No, it's certainly not out of the question. And the October vulnerability for our area does concern me, especially when we talked about how this season we would possibly see some storms forming pretty close to the coast in the Gulf is certainly pretty prime for that, unfortunately. Yeah, despite El Nino being out there, which typically, decreases the number of storms that do form because it increases the wind shear in the atmosphere. We have seen a lot of these tropical waves kind of fight for their life, basically survive. And we have made it up to, what is this? This Lee is 12 named storms now. And then we had one unnamed storm in January that the National Hurricane Center went back and determined it was a tropical storm. Obviously never got a name. So technically we have 13 total storms for the year. And we're just in the middle of it. So it does look like we are going to end up being above average, but hopefully we'll have more storms that end up being fish storms. Now, Margot's the next name on the list there, Ed. 96L just rolled off the coast of Africa. That one looks like it is going to move off to the north, but those longer range forecast models, they keep spinning up these tropical waves that move off the coast.
Yeah, this is that time of the year, the tropical wave train off of Africa. So, it's amazing, I think, if you look even just the last 4 weeks, and this is pretty typical of of hurricane seasons in the Atlantic, you go from an incredibly quiet stretch, which we really had through most of July and even early August, and all it takes is a week or two, and bam, the entire Atlantic lights up. And so, as you mentioned, we're really within that peak time, September 10th being the peak of the season, and even as you guys mentioned, October, especially once we get to those cold fronts and start getting down into the warmer, Gulf waters, it's not out of the question you get things to spin up out there. We've seen it happen many times, and then down into the Caribbean as well. So even all the way through October, you got to kind of keep your guard up and make sure you stay on top of any alerts from local media and certainly the National Hurricane Center as well, because again, we go all the way through November 30th with our hurricane season.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the cold fronts coming through, Ed, because the trough that we are banking on for this storm to kind of lift off to the north and stay out in the Atlantic, that's kind of what we look for toward the end of September and October. Those deeper troughs coming in, that southern edge of the jet stream kind of lingers over the Gulf of Mexico, and we can see those spin up. So at this point, we're banking on this trough making its way this far south because of the fact that it's going to pull and kind of push Lee out to sea, keep it out to sea. But during the end of the month and toward October, that's what we look for some of those quick spin ups. So all kind of an interesting atmospheric setup. And I think Rebecca, been talking about that kind of all year long, really just a weird summer for our weather pattern, weird summer for the tropics, El Nino, those warm water temperatures kind of battling it out.
Yes, and so we've seen such warm sea surface temperatures that made all of us really concerned all season long, and we still are concerned just because that's like gasoline sitting out there waiting to be used by these storms.
Yeah, so we are seeing somewhat of the warm water temperatures win out, helping to fuel some of those storms. But at this point, we're hoping for them to continue to stay fish storms. I will say, if you're anywhere in the vicinity of the Bahamas or in Bermuda, or if you have family anywhere near there, or if you have maybe a cruise planned in that general area over the next week, 10 days, this is a storm to keep an eye on. Again, Florida, I'm a little less concerned about for this storm, but the east coast of the United States, Bermuda especially, and even the kind of the eastern edge of the Bahamas, those forecast models will have a chance to waver back and forth, Ed, over the next week. I mean, it's unusual. I thought it was unusual for us to see Idalia's forecast models to be in such good agreement at from the beginning to the end of the storm. And we're kind of seeing that as well. But again, there is still some time for those to kind of shift back east and west.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, probably due just to advancements in our forecasting technology. Things get a little bit better every single year, and yeah, there's been some remarkable agreement in the last couple of storms, but like you kind of said, this is kind of, I think you use the analogy, this is kind of like a battle between these upper level systems, and really, when you kind of put it in, when we are just kind of the secondary effects from this. This is really a battle between that big high, the big trough coming in, trying to decide where this thing's going to go. But like, as you said, I mean, pretty good agreement this so far, especially, and you tend to see that with these faster moving tropical systems out there early on. Once they start to slow down, though, we have to we'll wait and see, because you'll notice when this thing starts to sort of hit the brakes, rounding that ridge north of Puerto Rico, you really start to see there's a noticeable spread there in the model guidance.
Yeah, and we have seen that kind of in a few previous runs of the American model. It's slowing down a lot more, giving it time to kind of sit there and decide where it wants to go, and the other steering currents build in different directions. So again, if you're along the East Coast, Bermuda and the eastern edge of the Bahamas, I do think that this is a storm that we should continue to watch for sure. And I mean, even in Florida, we're going to be talking about it for the next week. It's pretty much the only thing we're going to be talking about, because our weather pattern has generally been really quiet since Labor Day. Even as we head into the weekend, the Tampa Bay area, we are going to see pretty quiet weather. So we're going to talk a lot about Lee, what will soon be Hurricane Lee, possibly even as of the 5 o'clock advisory today, it might strengthen into a hurricane because it's in that really favorable environment. So certainly a storm here that we are going to keep an eye on. We do have a question coming in from Courtney on the WFLA Facebook page. Will it hit North Carolina? And that's kind of just it right on cue for what I was just saying. If you're along the east coast of the United States, which does include North Carolina, South Carolina, you guys kind of jut out there from the United States, something to keep an eye on for sure. Now, the forecast models right now, those spaghetti plots kind of they get a little bit closer sometimes to the East Coast. So it's something that we are going to keep an eye on. But at the moment, we are talking about, a lower chance for that to happen, but not a non-zero chance.
Yeah. And something I would also mention, even with this storm, if it starts to sort of follow this similar track, maybe like pull a Franklin and kind of work its way up the coast. Something that Franklin did, I don't think it got a whole lot of coverage, especially on the Carolina beaches, was the amount of beach erosion that we actually saw from those storms. And so you're talking about another storm that's going to help to kind of beat up the beaches there with some significant wave heights, especially during high tide. So just from several other storms, those beaches are going to take a beating here, even as this starts moving north into next week.
Yeah, Franklin, I feel like we didn't get to talk a lot about because Idalia was, obviously barreling through the Gulf of Mexico toward the panhandle of Florida, the Big Bend. But it was a massive storm. It did look healthy on satellite. It had that classic hurricane look, and it did propagate those waves out of the East Coast. This is going to be a very similar story, very similar looking storm, kind of taking a similar path, hoping it, kind of recurves out. So yes, if you're in North Carolina, you might not even see a direct hit, but if you're along the coast, you will see those beach coastal impacts from what is Lee right now, Tropical Storm Lee, and expected to become a major hurricane. I'm also fascinated by the forecast models and how they are bringing it to that major hurricane status so quickly, and the National Hurricane Center bought into that. The first track that we got from this yesterday, Rebecca, it was immediate that the National Hurricane Center was going to be a Category 3, then a Category 4 by this weekend, and now with the latest forecast track, it actually occurs that a little bit sooner.
Yes, and so I think the fact that it's over such warm sea surface temperatures is why the National Hurricane Center immediately bought into that intensity, and the fact that when we looked at the shear, it does have a little pocket of lower shear within the next 24 hours is when we'll start to see that.
Yeah, so as we go through the next couple of days, folks, and our viewers here on Tracking the Tropics, you're going to hear a lot about Lee over the next few days. I would check in once a day or so to see if there are any major changes, right? But at the moment, we are going to, I think, wrap up this episode of Tracking the Tropics. We're going to keep an eye on those steering currents. Ed, before we let you go, thanks for joining us here on Tracking the Tropics. Again, familiar face of the program. What are you going to be watching for with Lee over the next few days as we head into the weekend?
Yeah, I'm going to be watching for those exact same things. Exactly how quickly does this thing ramp up? And like you said, the worst environment that it's going to face over the next 4 to 5 days is basically now with its weak shear. The conditions only expected to get better here. And we could see they've warned again of this rapid strengthening expected to occur again. So I'll see if the model guidance is good and see if they've handled this storm very well. And again, we could be talking about a very strong, maybe high-end Category 4 hurricane. So this is going to be quite a big issue, even if it does not make any kind of direct landfall. So folks need to stay on top of it.
And we will, of course, do that as well here on Tracking the Tropics. If there is anything you need to be aware of over the next couple of days, you'll see myself or Rebecca here on Tracking the Tropics updating you on the very latest with what will be Hurricane Lee, currently Tropical Storm Lee. If also you missed any part of this episode, remember you can watch it, rewatch this episode and all past episodes on trackingthetropics.tv. You can also stream them with your favorite podcast streaming service, Spotify, Apple Podcasts as well. So that's all on trackingthetropics.tv. But for now, we'll wrap up today's episode of Tracking the Tropics. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll, of course, keep you updated on the latest with Lee.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.